Esther chapter 2. We're going to finish chapter 2 and look at all of chapter 3. Chapter 3 is short, but we're going to make a big jump in the story tonight. So Esther chapter 2, last week we got down to verse 18. So we'll pick it up here in verse 19. It says, "And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Esther had not yet showed her kindred, nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. In those days, while yet Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth, and they sought to lay hands on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king." And then chapter 3 it says, "And after these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him, and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. And then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. In the first month, that is in the month Nisan, in the 12th year of the king Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman from day to day, and from month to month to the 12th month, that is the month Adar. And Haman said unto the king Ahasuerus, There is certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of the kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasuries. And the king took his ring from his hand, and he gave it unto Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, The silver is given to thee, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to thee. And then there were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants, and to the governors that were over every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province, according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, in the name of King Ahasuerus was it written, and sealed with the king's ring. And the letters were sent by post into all the king's provinces, to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take spoil of them for a prey. And the copy of the writing of the commandment to be given of every province was published unto all the people, that they should be ready against that day. The post went out, being hastened by the king's commandment. And the decree was given in Shushan the palace, and the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city Shushan was perplexed. And so we have referenced Mordecai already. We know that Mordecai is Esther's cousin, but he was the one who raised her parents having died. And so Mordecai brought her in and raised her as his own daughter. But now we kind of get to his side of this particular story. Now we're, for some reason, we're not told why, but for some reason in verse 19, there's a second gathering. There's a second gathering, all the virgins, all the women who were brought before Ahasuerus, of which Esther was chosen. There's now a second gathering. We don't know why, but I guess I could say there are many who think that this was likely to kind of showcase Esther. But nevertheless, during this particular gathering, we're told in verse 19, it says, Then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Now, as we've talked about in the past, to sit in the king's gate was a reference to some sort of governmental position. Mordecai held some kind of role in the government there. This is very similar to Lot. You read in Genesis chapter 19 that Lot sat in the gate. This is the same kind of wording, and that's just because the gate of the city was typically where business was handled. It's almost akin to what we might think of our city council meetings. That's kind of what took place there. And so to sit in the gate then was to hold some kind of position where you were responsible for something. You had authority over something. Obviously, we're not told what that was, but Mordecai, the fact that the wording tells us that it happened then at that second gathering, Again, we can't be dogmatic about it, but it seems to say that this Mordecai attained this position after Esther was made queen. And if that's the case, it is possible, and I would say probably likely, that he got the position because Esther was queen. That she, put in a good name for him, and Mordecai was given this role. Now, we are told again that Esther was able to conceal the fact that she was a Jew. Now, we talked about this last week, but we're not just, I'll say it this way, we're removed from that year of purification. We are removed now from that 1 year where she was preparing for, coming before King Ahasuerus. We're years past this now. Once we get into chapter 3, we're 5 years after Esther was made queen. And so we're still at a point where, for at least a couple of years now, Esther has been able to hide this fact. That it is unquestionably true now that Esther is not living according to the covenant. She cannot be and still be able to conceal this from everybody in the kingdom. Now, as I said last week, that doesn't mean that she is not an example for some things. I think she's an incredibly wise woman. Obviously, we know where the story's going. She's an incredibly brave woman, but she's not to be, looked to as this picture of morality. I don't think that's what the book bears her out. And so she's able to conceal this. And again, we're told she does this because Mordecai tells her to. And so this is a fascinating aspect that Mordecai, for some reasons, perhaps we'll talk about here in a moment, we might get a possible reason why he would tell her to conceal this. But I will say that there is a small a way to look at this that is positive, because we're told again specifically she's doing this because Mordecai is telling her to. Meaning, whereas I can't say, had Mordecai not told her this, that she would have lived boldly as a Jew, that she would have obeyed the covenant, that she would have done all the things that we think of with regards to an Old Testament Jew. However, to the fact that we've been told now twice that she did this because Mordecai tells her to shows us that she is, at minimum, submitting to the man that is in essence her father. Right? He's not really her father, but for all practical purposes, Mordecai was the father of Esther. He is her, at bare minimum, her authority figure. And so Esther is submitting to him, which was good. However, we do want to make sure that whereas we are told to submit to the authorities who are over us, that is true, we don't submit when those authorities are calling upon us to do something that is unbiblical. And in this particular case, that does seem like that's what Mordecai was asking her to do. Now, of course, God is going to use this. We'll see this. We won't see this tonight. But as we get farther into the story, God is going to use the fact that, Ahasuerus at least didn't know that she was a Jew. He's going to use that. But that does not mean that is a commendable thing that Esther did. God is certainly able and does use the sinful actions of people to bring to pass his will. He didn't cause it, but he uses it. This is something that the entire Bible bears out. Now, given the importance of this particular event, I don't want to get ahead of myself here. So Mordecai is sitting in the gate. He's performing his duties. Again, we don't know exactly what they were, but he's doing what he's supposed to be doing. He overhears this plot, and there's these two men who have this plot to assassinate King Ahasuerus, which, interestingly enough, just historically, many years later, Ahasuerus was actually assassinated. But here, they wanted to do it. They openly talked about it, which wasn't the wisest thing for these two guys to do. Mordecai hears this, tells it to Esther. Esther tells it to the king. They investigate, find out that Mordecai was actually, absolutely right. They have the men hanged. And so this small, seemingly small event is going to play a major role in this story. And it's going to set up things that God's going to use to help the Jews in the situation they're going to find them in. And so what we have here, again, another situation where Esther's full of these, another situation where even though God's name is not there, he's very clearly at work. Many, many people would probably look at this and say, well, what a coincidence, right? What a coincidence that Mordecai happened to be there at the time that these two men were, voicing their intentions out loud to assassinate the king. Not a smart thing to do. It's not a coincidence. I've said this in the past, but I do not believe in coincidence when we serve a God who is sovereign. Right? Things don't just happen to fall into place. God providentially moves them according to his will. And so this is another instance. Again, was God named? No, but God's hand was there. And you have to really, really not want God to be moving in the story of Esther to say that God is absent from the story of Esther. And then we're introduced in chapter 3, we're introduced to Haman. And Haman, he's if you want the title, he's the villain of the story. And so Haman is a man, and we're not told what he brings to the table that Ahasuerus saw in him. But we're told in verse 1 that he was advanced by Ahasuerus. It says, above all the princes that were with him. And so, Ahasuerus saw something in him. He liked him, whatever the case was, but he advanced him up above everybody. And then he goes so above that to command everybody who's in the king's gate, which again would be all, those who are working for the king. Everybody in the king's gate has to bow and they have to give reverence to Haman when he enters. And of course, we know Mordecai refuses to do this. And then the text tells us that day after day, Haman is entering. Everybody's bowing except for Mordecai. He refuses to do this. Everybody's coming to Mordecai and telling him, what are you doing? Don't you know the king's commandment here? Don't you know, how dumb you're being by disobeying the commandment of the king? Every day is taking place. Every day Mordecai refuses. And eventually, word gets back to Haman who he is. I don't think Haman was ignorant of the fact that this was taking place. But now Haman finds out who Mordecai is. And so at this particular point, the text tells us that Haman becomes full of wrath. He's overcome with anger. And then knowing that he was a Jew, we're told specifically that he thought, and the wording here, let me explain, in verse 6, it says, and he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone. In other words, he didn't like the idea of just coming after Mordecai. That's not what he wanted to do. And so the rest of verse 6, what did he want to do? He wanted to go after the people of Mordecai. Right? It's not just Mordecai. I want to come after all of them. And so what makes this particular portion of the story of Esther so intriguing is we don't actually know the exact reason why Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman. Because there's several options. There are several options that fit within the history. There's several options that fit just biblically within the story. And there's some that are very, very interesting. And so it could just be as simple as Mordecai is a Jew. He refuses to bow down to someone who's not a Jew or to anybody other than God. I have heard people say, it's just as simple as reverence. Mordecai doesn't want to reverence anybody other than God. However, we have, and I put a couple in there, but there's more than this. We have examples in the Old Testament of Jews bowing down and giving reverence to authority, to kings. And in fact, David did this. David's wife did this. Abraham did this. And so it doesn't seem as though, generally speaking, this was something that the Jews would have said was sinful. Obviously, you don't worship the figure, but to just bow down and show honor to the figure, to the office, to the authority, that was not something that the Jews saw as inherently sinful. Now, again, I can't say that that's not the reason why he was doing it, but we do have examples that would show that perhaps that was not why he was doing it. It could be that Mordecai knew that Haman had a severe hatred for and was a known enemy of the Jewish people at large. Obviously, the story supports this. Haman, we'll talk more about this in a second. Haman was an Amalekite. And the Amalekites and the Israelites had a long-standing hatred for one another. It went all the way back to the wilderness when the Amalekites attacked the Israelites. And God actually said, right, there's going to be animosity there, and eventually God's going to wipe them out, right? And so it just simply could be the fact that him being an Amalekite, Mordecai being a Jew, well, our people just don't like one another. And of course, as I just pointed out there in verse 6, Haman, instead of just wanting to deal with Mordecai, which would seem to be the logical solution, right? Here's this one guy who's not bowing down to me. And instead of saying, I'm going to deal with just Mordecai, he concocts this idea to take out all the Jews in the entire kingdom, right? And so obviously Haman had a Jew problem, right? He had a problem with the people, not just the man Mordecai. And so it could be that. And then some take this a little bit farther and say it could be even more personal than that. And this is the one that I found most fascinating. Haman, we're told this in verse 1 of chapter 3, that he was the son of Hamathath, but he says that he is an Agagite. An Agagite. In chapter 2, verse 5, Mordecai is described as a Benjamite, but specifically a Benjamite from the line of Kish. It says in chapter 2, verse 5, now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. And so he is a Benjamite from the line of Kish. Now these two terms, Kish and Agag, take us back to a specific story in 1 Samuel 15. In 1 Samuel 15, God calls on Saul to wipe out the Amalekites for the very reasons we just talked about. And so King Saul was supposed to go and wipe out the Amalekites who were being led by that time by King Agag. And so Saul goes and he fails to do this. He keeps Agag plus a few others. He keeps them alive. He takes their sheep. He takes, the best animals and everything. And he comes back and Samuel confronts him about this, right? God told you to kill them all. And Saul deflects. Well, I wanted to, but the people who were with me didn't want to. He tries to deflect everything. In fact, this is the reason why God takes the kingdom away from Saul and gives it to David, was for this specific sin. And this, led to Samuel himself being the one to kill Agag. In fact, the text says that he hewed him in pieces. And so this is, there's a long-standing history then, if these two men are direct descendants of those two kings. Saul's father was Kish. And so it very well could be that Mordecai was a direct descendant of King Saul, and it very well could be that Haman was a direct descendant of King Agag. And so if that's the case, again, there's a long-standing history not only between Amalekite and Israelite, but a long-standing family feud, right? I'm the Hatfields, you're the McCoys. We don't get along. And so again, we can't say with any degree of certainty what the exact reason was, but Mordecai had a reason. Now, the whole point really of saying this is along the lines that we've been saying with Esther. I can't just come along and say Mordecai was just being an upstanding Jewish individual and was refusing to worship somebody because he was trying to give worship and honor to God. Maybe that was the case, but it could be that he just simply had a distaste for this guy because there's a family feud that goes back centuries, right? And again, we can't say with any degree of certainty, but this is the event, interestingly enough, that sets up the major obstacle of the book. And so God, again, he used, even if it was just a family feud, God uses that to bring the whole situation to pass. And so, because Haman feels like he's being disrespected, and not just disrespected by anybody, it's not some random Persian doing this, but it's a Jewish person, and possibly not any Jew, a son of Kish. He feels incredibly disrespected. And so, 5 years after Esther becomes queen, Haman takes this problem before the king. He takes it to Ahasuerus. And just like, and I found this interesting, in chapter 1, Vashti disrespects Ahasuerus. What do his counselors tell him? It's not just a Vashti problem. Now you have a problem with every woman in the kingdom, right? Well, what does Haman do? Haman comes, and it's not just a Mordecai problem. No, you have a problem with every Jew in your kingdom, right? And so they blow these things well out of proportion. And so Haman comes to tell him, he says, there's people living in every one of your provinces, and they don't follow your laws, and they don't do what Persians are supposed to do, and they refuse to keep the king's laws, which I find interesting because Esther is already proof that that's not exactly the case, but nevertheless, that's a whole other conversation. But he tells them, right, that ultimately he says, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. It's going to hurt you, ultimately, Ahasuerus, if you don't commit genocide against this particular people. Furthermore, he takes a step farther, right? We're going to be able to plunder them once we kill them. And what through the plunder, we'll be able to take 10,000 talents of silver and put it into the king's treasury. 10,000 talents of silver was a significant sum of money. And so, there's a little bit of bribery here as well. Well, the king has already proven himself to not, be too discerning when it comes to things other people are telling him. So he falls with, in fact, chapter 3 gives us seemingly no pushback whatsoever. Oh, there's an entire people we should kill? That's fine. Go ahead and do it. All right, there seems to be no pushback by the king whatsoever. In fact, he says, here's some money to carry this out. Let me give you some people to help you do it. And here's my ring to seal the proclamation so that, we'll see this more later, but if it comes from the king, it's unbreakable. You cannot change this. This is going to take place. And so the proclamation itself stated that Persians would be allowed to, quote, destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, to take the spoil of them for a prey. And so this was the proclamation. If you see a Jewish person, it doesn't matter what their age is, not only are you allowed to, you are commanded to kill them, destroy them, to plunder them. Now, interestingly, one more little tidbit here before we close. The date laid out in the proclamation, the date laid out is the 13th day of the 12th month. Now, if you look at the beginning of, let's see, which verse is it? Verse 12, it says, then were the king's scribes called upon the 13th day of the first month. And so they're writing this proclamation in month 1, and they're saying that the date that this is all going to take place is in month 12. And so they push the date almost a full year out in advance. And we see why, because earlier in the chapter, verse 8, it says that Haman said to King, back up to verse 7. In the first month, that is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman from day to day, month to month. And so essentially what they did is they sat before a calendar. And they said, we're going to cast lots for every single day from now until the lots fall in our favor. And essentially what they're doing is they're searching for good omens. The Persians were known for this, right? We got to wait for the day with the best omen. They would determine when they went to battle based upon what, omens gave them the best opportunity to win. And so here, Haman and his men, they're casting these lots. They're practicing witchcraft and sorcery is essentially what they're doing. And they choose a date that is almost a full year later than the day of the writing. And why that matters is because here again, God uses this incredibly sinful situation, but he uses it in order to allow time for his will to come to pass, right? And so he's going to allow time, as we're going to see, for what other people might call this chance encounter, where the king just can't sleep. And he's staying up all night. And he's just like, I got to find out some way to get to sleep. So he just find me the most boring thing I could possibly read. Right? And he's just reading through these things. And all of a sudden, what does he happen to fall upon? Oh, I remember that guy Mordecai who saved my life. Right? Maybe I should reward that guy somehow. And so, God allows for the sinful situation of Haman and his people, not only in their plot to kill the Jews, but in the way in which they determined the date. He allows for all this. Why? Because he used it to bring to pass his will. And so after then, as the chapter closes, after the commandment is given, you see the coldness that was in their heart. In verse 15, the posts go out, and at the end of the verse it says, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. Right? I mean, think about what they just did. Right? They just sent out a commandment to their people, again, to try and commit genocide against all the Jews in the nation of Persia. And yet they sit down to drink. But look at this. The people, those who are actually interacting with the Jews who have just had a death note written about them, it says they were perplexed. They didn't like this, but the king and Haman, they sit down to drink. And so as they're sitting there sipping their tea, right, the rest of the nation is wondering, why is this taking place? And so evil was most definitely at work, but as we've already seen, God is greater, and the power of God would overcome the power of evil. And so this is, again, just such a fascinating, interesting story with, kind of these twists and turns are on every corner. And it's why the book of Esther is so popular and why it has stood the test of time. Okay, well, as far